Once we've made the initial offer on that new home, a lot of the excitement takes a bit of a dip when the requirements around the bond registration process kicks in. Well, bond originator Natasha Champion explains why clarity around this process is actually so empowering. Natasha, welcome to All About Property.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now we're talking about the bond registration process, and it normally takes around 3 months for a bond to transfer into the new owner's name. But there are instances where it can happen quicker or where the process can be delayed. Talk to us about these instances.
The basic process would go quicker, potentially if it was an unbonded seller. Okay. That would negate the need for a bond cancellation attorney, or indeed if the purchaser was going cash and there wasn't a bond to be registered over that property. So those are the two instances that could streamline the process.
Okay.
Also, if the seller has got his rates up to date. One of the criteria to register a property is to have a valid rates clearance certificate. Okay. So that helps if the seller's up to date with those rates. And then obviously from a buyer and a seller's perspective, be available to sign whatever is required to be signed. Be prepared to part with the necessary FICA documentation. That is not the banks or the attorneys trying to be difficult. It is a regulation. So a lot of people waste time on that side by saying, but I've already given it to this person and I don't have it, or just comply.
Yes.
Whatever is requested from you by whichever party in the transaction, the quickest way is to provide what's required, and that will help make the transfer process a lot smoother.
Now, the real estate agent would normally facilitate the signing of the offer to purchase between the buyer and the seller. Talk to us about what can the buyer and the seller expect from this real estate agent during this time?
So it's interesting because in this country, the estate agent represents the seller. They are mandated by the seller to sell their property. Once they engage with the buyer, that buyer also becomes their client. So they are the intermediary between seller and buyer and really need to make sure that everyone's interests are taken into account. Their responsibility is certainly to guide that purchaser through every step of the process, including page by page, clause by clause, of that offer to purchase. It's so crucial when you're undertaking a legal document, and a lot of people forget that an offer to purchase is a legally binding document. It's very important to understand, and your real estate agent will have experience with the document itself and with the process on a larger scale.
So now we're at the point, both parties have signed, we now have a sales contract, and this is where we now need to apply for a bond. And this is also where the bond originator would play a huge role. Talk to us about what would happen during this whole process.
So in an offer to purchase, there'll be a clause known as a suspensive condition. And that is generally something that needs to be achieved in order for the contract to go through. Okay. A suspensive condition when a purchaser is applying for a bond will be a loan approval to the amount of X within X time period. Okay. So firstly, you are restricted to your time period to get a loan.
What would the general time period be? 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
So for a salaried applicant, someone with a payslip, we say between 14 and 21 days. It's always better to give 21 days. Okay. We find the longest lead time is actually getting the required documents from the purchaser. So that can eat up 7 days of your 14 days, then we're tight.
Yeah.
So 21 days would be my advice for a salaried. You know, when it comes to a self-employed applicant, I'd say anywhere from 45 to 60. Again, because of the time it takes to prepare the required documentation. Having said that, if you'd engaged with us prior to shopping around, we'd cut that time right down because we'd be ready.
You would have all that documentation already.
So that's the dream.
Natasha, during this whole bond registration process, there are 3 sets of attorneys involved. Who are they and what are their roles?
So the first sets of attorneys that would probably get involved would be the bond cancellation attorneys. So they would come into the picture if the seller has got a bond over the property that he's selling. They're appointed by the bank to make sure that the bond gets cancelled. Then the transferring attorneys, who are appointed by the seller to represent the seller's interests in the transaction, but funny enough, are paid by the buyer. Then you've got the bond registration attorneys. The bond registration attorneys are nominated by the bank and represent the bank and the buyer. They make sure that the bond is registered over the property in the new purchaser's name.
Natasha, just in closing, any last thoughts on the bond registration process?
I've seen it, it's amazing. It's kind of like asking how long a piece of string is. I've seen it happen in 2 weeks and I've seen it take 18 months. So unforeseen issues can pop up when we go through this process. Deeds office strikes, for example, kind of things that we have no control over. So I think it's always best to focus on the things we do have control over and make sure that we're providing everything that's required and that we are committed to the offer to purchase as a legal document and the deposit requirements. Signing what needs to be signed and providing what needs to be provided is definitely going to go a long way in helping speed up the process.
Lovely. Always great chatting to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.